Hey everyone, welcome to what is supposed to be a very introductory lesson on breaking down a rhetorical analysis prompt and passage for any rhetorical analysis, but we're going to be working off of an AP language prompt that is called the Plastic Pink Flamingo. So you should have that prompt. I don't have it for you. I can neither confirm nor deny that if you did a Google search for that prompt, you may or may not be able to find it. Anyway, it would be great also if you could do a couple things if you have not done so already. You should read this passage and the prompt, you should annotate it, and you should try to figure out where is the tonal shift or multiple tonal shifts. Right? That idea of a tonal shift is when a writer moves from focusing on one aspect or one idea to another. Now, a passage can have multiple tonal shifts, but we have to think of this in terms of, I have to sit down and write an essay in 40 minutes. So I want to limit my focus on one tonal shift before and after, or at the very most 2 tonal shifts. But if I do 2 tonal shifts, I'm going to have to write more, 3 paragraphs probably, just as a basic rule of thumb. So you should have read this passage, annotated it, and figured out those tonal shifts, so you're kind of prepared for us to jump in and talk about this. Okay, and the second thing you have is what I'm calling the rhetorical arch of archiness. And I've seen the rhetorical arch before, but I've kind of developed this a little bit more, and I did share that with you. So it's great if you could either print this out, so you could write on it, or you could create your own. But let's talk about the parts of this rhetorical arch and how we're going to use it. So at the top of the rhetorical arch of archiness, you can see there's a Q and an A. We develop a question based on what the prompt is asking us to do. So when we read through the prompt, we're trying to come up with a guiding question that basically presents the task of what we have to do in the rhetorical analysis essay, right? Underneath that is the A, and that's kind of your answer. Your answer is going to be the kind of the broad brush or the broad scope of what you're going to be proving. So the answer should have the author's purpose in some way. And if we know the audience of the author, it can also be in this answer as well. So, the author desires to do blank for his or her audience blank so that, and then give a reason why. Then you can see that there's 2 columns underneath that, right? You have the author's purpose before the tonal shift, and then you have the author's purpose after the tonal shift. And what does that do for me if I'm able to break it down into those 2 things, right? So number one, you know the importance of discovering the tonal shift. It gives me 2 directions to go in my essay, plus it gives me a more narrow line of reasoning as I work through this essay that I can focus on, like, well, before this tonal shift, the author wants to do this. And then I can move into, after the tonal shift, the author's purpose after the tonal shift is to do this. So it gives me 2 directions or 2 things to focus on. And you could, again, do a 3rd tonal shift as well, the 3rd part, and accomplish the same thing. And underneath that, you can see I kind of have 4 blocks in each row. Well, those are pairs. Rhetorical choice and quote, and then impact and intent of that choice. So it's this idea that to accomplish that purpose, the author has made certain choices in his or her writing, and so we want to quote those choices. Now, this is where people will sometimes just list or talk about rhetorical devices, whether it's a classical allusion or a simile or repetition, and there's a lot of them. I mean, I have a whole playlist on advanced English on our channel that talks through a lot of rhetorical devices. But the point is, it's not so much that you can list a rhetorical device, but that you can identify how choices, what the writer includes, like a simile or like repetition, that they made a choice there, and there's a reason they made that choice. So for this chart, at least, what you're doing is you're recognizing choices to accomplish the purpose. So you would be like, in that box, here's repetition, and here's a quote for repetition, and what do I think that repetition was meant to do to accomplish the purpose of the author. And we'll talk through how to do that as we look into this prompt a little bit. But that's the basic idea. So by the time you filled out this arch of archiness, you have basically a core of a thesis statement for your answer to the question. You have a body paragraph thesis statement for the purpose before the tonal shift. You have evidence, at least 2 pieces that you can bring in, and you could do more than that. And then you've already have like an idea of what you might talk about or what you might say for the impact or intent of that choice. And so I kind of have a guide then, so I don't lose track when I sit down and I write this essay. So there's your rhetorical arch of archiness. Now let's talk through how to use this to do a brainstorm before I actually write a rhetorical analysis essay. So before we move further, let's just say if you read this passage now and you're struggling with understanding some of the things going on, I did do a video where I kind of talked through understanding this prompt a little better. Now, I didn't give out like all the answers. I did not tell you what to think. I just gave some leading questions as I talked through it in that video, and that's in the playlist of Writer's Workshop. So if you're struggling with really knowing kind of what's the movement in this passage, go check out that video, and it'll hopefully, kind of push you a little bit to think through it. I just didn't tell you what everything meant, but I did talk through a thought process to help tackle that. So go watch that video if you're reading this and you're like, this is a little challenging, which totally understandable. It's supposed to be, right? So let's talk through then, how are we going to fill out this rhetorical arch of archiness? First of all, we have to come up with the question. So let's look at this prompt, right? Below is the excerpt, blah, blah, blah. It examines the popularity of the flamingo. Read the passage carefully. Then write an essay in which you analyze how Price crafts the text. All right, it's usually a phrase like that. Craft the text means makes rhetorical choices or puts together her argument to reveal her view of the United States culture. So there's the key part there, right? So our question has to encompass that idea. So what might that look like? All right, so I might say something like, what is Price's view of United States culture and how does she develop her perspective? Now, this isn't a perfect question, but the check of this question is, okay, does this answer the prompt? And as we said just a moment ago, right, the prompt wants to know, how does she craft the text, i.e. develop her perspective? And what's her view of United States culture? So I ask point blank. So I want to make sure I give the view of her view of United States culture and how she develops that perspective, right? How she crafts the text. So my answer to that can be crafted into a working thesis, but the question has helped me focus on what I'm going to do. So there's 2 ways to go about this. Number 1, I can come up with the purpose before the tonal shift and after the tonal shift, and then I can kind of combine those to get the bigger picture for my answer. Or I could give my answer and then kind of break that apart into 2 different purposes or arguments that I'm going to use in my body paragraph. So that's the first step, is to write that question. So how might I answer that? So a reminder, the assumption here as we work through this together is that you've read this passage and have kind of a grasp on, a tonal shift and what the purposes of this essay might be. So in this case, I'm giving you kind of an answer that has some fill in the blanks, a template, if you will. Price believes American culture through the 1950s to be blank and blank through comparison to something about the iconic plastic Pink Flamingo. So looking before the tonal shift, right, we could say something maybe about superficial or greed. Remember that whole passage, the whole part of it before the tonal shift is talking about how this flamingo was a symbol of wealth and luxury, and how this desire to obtain that trickled down to even the lower classes. So I'm probably going to be focusing in that first blank and also the first paragraph on something about superficial desire for wealth, or wanting to have a quick riches, something along those lines. Again, I don't want to give you the answer. I want you to think through that. And then the second blank and blank, we're now looking after the tonal shift. And after the tonal shifts, it talks a lot about being more style than substance, which is kind of like superficial, but it's being like larger than life. It's about image and how things look, being flashy, being bold. And so this is kind of the direction I might be going in after the tonal shift. And so those are my two focuses of the essay, the before the tonal shift and the after the tonal shift. And then I want to develop this, more into a thesis statement in my answer, just to save myself time later, right? I'm trying to do this quickly because I have to write an essay. So I put through comparison to the blank of the iconic plastic Pink Flamingo. And so I might say something like, to the popularity and boldness, or the popularity and loud coloration, something like that. Again, I'm not giving an answer, but just pushing to think through that. So now let's look at the author's purpose before and after the tonal shift, and how we'll move through the rest of this brainstorm chart. All right, so now we're looking at the purpose before the tonal shift and after. And I don't want you to think I did anything special or tricky here. What I really did was I just broke my answer into two parts and just embellished a little bit. I developed it a little bit. But again, I've left blanks here kind of like as a template to help you think through what you might say or what you might go after. Now, what you might go after or what you might say is really going to be dependent on the annotations that you did on this piece, because for the half of the passage before the shift, you should have noticed some things that would back this up, and the same thing for after the shift, that you would have noticed and annotated some of these rhetorical choices or rhetorical moves, however you want to word it, of the author. So my first potential, my first nugget for a thesis statement for body paragraph. For price, comma, the symbolism of the flamingo standing for wealth and luxury reveals her belief that Americans were, and then I'm going to develop that idea based on what I think I can prove. And then afterwards, the bright, bold, and flash of the gaudy pink of the pink flamingo, plastic flamingo, embodies Price's feeling that American culture was, and then again, what do I think I can argue? So now I have a nugget for my thesis statement, and therefore kind of the core of my intro. I have a thesis for my body paragraph that talks about the author's purpose before the tonal shift, and then a thesis statement for what the author argues after the tonal shift. And now I have to look through that part of the passage and kind of focus on a couple pieces of evidence that will back me up and talk about that. So let's do, I'm going to talk through and work through one rhetorical choice and quote and what I might say about impact and intent for both of these, and then you will be on your own for the second one of each, just to get you going. Right? So let's do that. So let's take a look at what I might actually do going into that passage to kind of back up what I'm saying here. And what I did is I picked a quote that basically gave the historical origin, at least in terms of how this bird, the penguin, came to symbolize wealth. And so I found like this historical reference about Miami Beach's first grand hotel, right, which was called the Flamingo, that made the bird synonymous with wealth and, quote, pizzazz. And so this, the author chose to kind of establish, when was the penguin kind of planted in the American mind as the symbol of wealth. And it's important, right? Because previous to this, Price even tells us the flamingo was hunted to near extinction and eaten. So this is kind of a pivotal time or a pivotal point to establish where she's going with this argument. So I chose that historical reference. Now, there's a name of a rhetorical device for that. But again, I'm not looking to just laundry list that I know a bunch of rhetorical devices. So I can simply say makes the historical reference or tells the history of, and that's going to work just fine. So what was the impact or intent of that choice? Why did this author bring this hotel into the narrative, into the actual argument here? And my thought was, well, this is what cemented the flamingo as, kind of an icon or iconic in the American mind, specifically with wealth and luxury. And why so? Well, it was where people vacationed. It was a glitzy, ritzy hotel that was expensive, where people vacation. And what do we connect with this idea of vacation? People serving us, luxury, relaxation, or I put ease here on here. And so that kind of is where I'm going to start to go with my choices here. And I could find and should find at least one more. Maybe I'll talk about the lower class or the working class bringing the flamingo to their New Jersey lawns. I could talk about that, bringing a little wealth from afar to home, or the reference to the Las Vegas gangster, which is easy money or the promise of riches. I can go in that direction as well. So that's some great choices for the first column there. And now you can kind of see my paragraph is coming into shape, and I can use these nuggets to develop my own narrative and my own argument here as to what is Price saying or believing about American culture. So let's take a quick look at the second column before we finish. And so we look at this one. So this was talking about how the boldness and the brightness, I use the word gaudy, which means kind of like obnoxious pink of the pink flamingo or the plastic flamingo, embodies Price's feeling maybe that American culture was showy or obsessed with image and wanted to, like, I guess not maybe brag, but to just kind of embrace this wild kind of celebratory lifestyle perhaps. So I found this quote at the beginning. It's like a historical background. And I would put that, something about gives a historical background that this was a population that was coming out of the Depression, and she had said, quote, ready to celebrate its new affluence. Right? So what is that, the impact or intent of that? Well, it has to do with the color being, symbolic of being showy and loud, larger than life or bold. Remember, when we talk about depression, and I'd probably talk about this, the depression, it was a time of constriction, of concern, of worry, of where the next meal was going to come from. It was a dark time. And so now, coming out of that depression, right, we have this, the bright pink, celebrating all of a sudden money being more prevalent or achievable. And so that's the direction I would go in for my first evidence choice. And then what else would I choose? Maybe something about the last paragraph there, the other cultures that elevated it for their reasons. Maybe the passage that talks about the plastic pink flamingo was a hotter pink than the real flamingo, and a real flamingo was already bolder than anything else around it. And what does that possibly say, or how does that bring out more of this aspect of her believing American culture is showy or superficial? So that's how I would kind of start to tackle the second body paragraph, or what I would be discussing in terms of the author's purpose after the tonal shift. So hopefully that was helpful in helping you kind of understand how to use what you've read in terms of your annotation and your understanding of what's being asked in the prompt to actually start to organize your line of reasoning, to put together your argument. You have to develop, understand what's being asked of you for the prompt. You have to come up with an answer to that. And then your answer to that is supposed to explain the author's purpose for the audience. You may know the audience, you may not, but the purpose is helping you then to trace how the author organizes his or her argument, and then the rhetorical choice is made to make that happen. So again, this is just a kind of intro to how do I deal with the prompt and deal with the passage, and then use my understanding of that passage to kind of sketch out a direction or an outline for an essay that I would have to write. So hopefully, as a preliminary intro to that, this was very productive for you, and that you kind of are getting a picture of how the rhetorical arch of archiness, which is what I call it, can be really useful to help you get your ideas down and give you a direction in which to follow as you write your rhetorical analysis essays. Take care. Thanks for watching this video. It would be awesome if you could subscribe to the channel. Here are some other videos in the writing workshop playlist where it can help you become a better writer, how to write essays and other things that I've explored with you. And then, of course, some additional playlists just to check out for funsies. We'll see you soon.